September of 1931, somewhere east of Norfolk, in the cold grey water above what was once a country. The wind comes off the open sea, slow, salt-thick, the colour of pewter on the water. Even at this early hour, the gulls are quiet. The light is thin. Nothing about the morning announces itself as remarkable. Most of the great moments in archaeology, in fact, look exactly like this. Cold weather, tired men, ordinary work, a bucket of mud and rope. And then, somewhere in the middle of all that ordinariness, the ground gives up something it has been carrying for thousands of years, and was, frankly, never going to volunteer. A Dutch trawler called the Colinda is working a long beam over the bottom of the southern North Sea. The sky is the colour of old tin. The wind is the kind of wind that smells of fish and weed and brine. The deck is wet. The men on board are tired in the way that fishermen are always tired. Not loudly, not dramatically, only in the slow, careful way of people who have not been warm or dry for several days. The water around them is shallow. By North Sea standards, almost everywhere here is shallow. The basin they are fishing is a wide silver tray of cold water sitting on top of a continental shelf, one of the most sediment-rich, most heavily worked, most stubbornly productive seabeds on Earth. The big bank east of them, the one the old fishermen call Dogger Bank, rises to within about 18 meters of the surface. The rest of the basin averages closer to 95 meters deep, give or take. Shallow by ocean standards, shallow enough that a beam trawl can reach the bottom, shallow enough that sometimes the bottom reaches back. The net comes up. The men sort the catch, and among the silver flicker of fish, there is a lump of black, fibrous, half-rotted peat. Peat. Out here, 60-something kilometres from the nearest land in the open North Sea. Someone breaks the lump open. Welcome to Midnight Volumes. Tonight, we sit with the drowned heartland of Doggerland. Inside the peat, half shrouded in the dark fibres of plants that grew in some long-vanished wetland, there is something pale and patient. A barbed point, long, thin, slightly curved, with the small, hard ridges of a row of teeth carved along one side. A harpoon, or a fish spear, made from the antler of a deer, worked by hand by a person on a piece of land that no human being on the Colinda has ever heard of, and that no map of Britain has ever shown. The peat is still soft. The harpoon is still sharp. When scientists look at it later, they will date it. They will give it a number that travels backwards into a time that was not yet history. A time when the area where the trawler now sits was not water at all, but tundra. A time, in other words, before the sea. This is the moment. Not the only moment, not the first hint even, but it is the moment that fixed itself in the public mind. The moment when a fishing boat dropped a piece of an unknown country onto its own deck. A whole landmass, forested, watered, walked on, hunted on, mourned on, slept 8,000 years beneath these grey waves before a dragnet brought a single thin spear of antler back to the air. This is the story of that country. Tonight, we go down to it. We will not hurry, we will not raise our voice. We will move the way the slow tide moved over its forests and meadows and salt marshes. Slowly, almost gently, until, in the end, everything is under. For most of the 20th century, almost nobody knew its name. Even now, most people, walking along a beach in Norfolk or Holland or Schleswig-Holstein, do not know that the wet sand under their feet is the rim of an entire drowned heartland. The peat the Colinda dragged up was just one of countless quiet warnings the sea had been delivering to fishermen for centuries. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too. Long before the Colinda, before the science had any name to give it, men working the southern North Sea had been pulling up things they could not explain. Mammoth tusks, bison teeth, the skulls of cave bears, of giant deer, of horses that were not the horses of the modern fields. Antler tools, worked flints, lumps of resin still smelling faintly of pine. They sold what they could to curious doctors and amateur naturalists. They threw the rest back. The bones did not fit into the world they thought they were fishing in, so most of them for a long time simply did not fit. They were brought up, they were forgotten, they were dropped. In 1913, an English naturalist named Clement Reid published a quiet, careful book called Submerged Forests. In it he gathered, for the first time in a really systematic way, all the plant remains that had been brought up from beneath the southern North Sea. Birch, hazel, pine, oak, reeds, rooted stumps, tree trunks lying flat as if they had fallen in a storm. He laid out, calmly, in plain prose, the only honest interpretation of all that material. Beneath these waves, he said, there used to be a forest with soil and roots and weather, a real walking around, breathing forest. 2 years later, in 1915, the anatomist Sir Arthur Keith took the next step. In a book called The Antiquity of Man, he asked the obvious question: if there had been a forest down there, then there might have been people. Where there had been people, there might be tools. Where there had been tools, there might have been art, songs, names for places, names for stars, names for one another, an entire world. At the time, almost nobody listened. The North Sea was the North Sea. The North Sea was a piece of geography, a piece of weather, a piece of British shipping. It was not, in the imagination of most people, a piece of human prehistory. Then the Colinda dropped its peat onto its deck. And in that lump, in the worked antler of a hunter who had never seen the sea, was a piece of evidence too sharp to ignore. The harpoon went into a museum drawer. It is still there. It is small. It is unspectacular. You could hold it in one hand, and if you did not know what it was, you might assume it had come from any one of 1,000 archaeological digs in any one of 1,000 peat bogs across northern Europe. There is nothing about it that screams, but it screamed for the patient ones, for the geologists who had been quietly counting the bones in the trawler dumps, for the archaeologists who had read Clement Reid, for the few who had begun to wonder what kind of country had been there, and how big it had been, and when it had ended, and how. The harpoon, dragged from the Ower bank east of the Wash, was their proof. Proof that the soil on the bottom of the sea was not just any soil. It was the soil of a Mesolithic country, a country with rivers, a country with hunters, a country, in other words, with a name. It would take another 66 years before someone gave that country its name. In 1998, in a paper that looks, from the outside, like a perfectly ordinary academic publication, the British archaeologist Bryony Coles wrote down 4 syllables that had not, until then, existed in any human language. Doggerland. After the Great Banks in the southern North Sea. After the Dutch fishing boats called doggers, clinker-built, two-masted, slow, patient, that had given the bank its modern name. After, most of all, the long, quiet recognition that something that vast and that important deserved to be called something. Coles also drew, with care and with caveats, the first speculative gazetteer of that country's lost rivers and coasts. After Doggerland was named, more and more people began to look for it. Geophysicists with their seismic data, biologists with their cores of frozen mud, archaeologists with their slow, patient questions. Around the rim of the southern North Sea, a small, unhurried group of researchers started to assemble, piece by piece, the missing map. It is one of the strangest stories in the science of the human past. Not because it was hidden, not because it was secret. Doggerland was hidden in the most ordinary way it is possible to hide a thing. It was hidden underwater, under cold, ordinary, workday water that 10,000 fishermen had been crossing every season for centuries. The country was not lost, it was simply submerged, out of mind, below the things people thought to ask. The fisherman who pulled the harpoon out of the peat could not have told you the date when the sea closed over his ancestors. He did not need to. He had a net to mend. The catch had to go to market. The peat went over the side. The harpoon, by some miracle, did not. It is also strange because Doggerland is not far away. It is not in the deep ocean. It is not under 3 kilometres of black water. It is, on average, less than 100 metres beneath the keel of any ferry between Hull and Rotterdam. You have probably crossed it in your life. You have probably looked out at the grey water from a deck and not realised that down there, somewhere beneath your shoes, are the rivers that fed it, and the marshes that drained into it, and the woodlands that walked north when the ice withdrew. The sea is not a wall, the sea is a lid. We will get to that map. We will get to the rivers and the marshes and the Mesolithic camps. We will get to the wave from the north. We will get, in the end, to the dark, calm sea that today rests above all of it, the water through which you have probably travelled at some point in your life without knowing. But for now, in the slow, dim opening of the night, we are still standing on the deck of the Colinda, or rather, not on the deck. Above the deck, in some long-imagined space where time runs both forward and backward at once, the trawler is below us, still slick with sea. The fishermen are below us, sorting their catch in their wet wool. The peat is below us, broken open, the harpoon catching the grey light. And below all of that, 8,000 years below it, and a few dozen meters below it, is the country. Nothing about the country itself was small. It stretched between what is now the east coast of Great Britain, northern France, Belgium, the Netherlands, northwestern Germany, and the Danish peninsula of Jutland. It had its own weather, its own forests, its own watershed, its own seasons, its own voices. It was not Atlantis. It is not a myth. It was a real, ordinary, lived-in piece of northern Europe, of which only a single trawler load of peat and one slim, curved spear of antler had so far been allowed to surface. Later in the night, we will meet its hunters. We will follow its rivers. We will see the ice withdraw, and the trees come, and the deer come behind the trees, and the people come behind the deer. We will watch the salt water move slowly into the lagoons, and the islands shrink, and the wave come down from the north. We will watch a continent, in slow motion, turn itself into a sea. But tonight, here, at the very beginning, all you need to hold is this small thing, no longer than your forearm. A barbed antler point, the work of someone who knew their land the way you know the road home. Someone who would never know that a Dutch fishing boat would, one cold day in 1931, drag their handiwork up out of the bottom of an ocean and put it on a wet deck under a tin-colored sky. Because that is, in the end, the simplest way to begin this story. Not with a map, not with a date, not even with a name. With a piece of evidence too sharp to ignore. A harpoon in a piece of peat on a deck. And the slow recognition in the people who held it that the bottom of the sea was once the surface of a world. There is a peculiar kind of patience in this work. The sea does not give things up quickly. It does not give them up tidily. Sometimes, in fact, it does not give them up at all. Most of Doggerland is still down there, still buried, still waiting. The trawlers have skimmed only the top layer of the bottom for 120 years. The seismic surveys have read only some of the sediment. The cores have sampled only a few thousand meters of mud out of a basin tens of thousands of square kilometers wide. The country is far larger than the evidence we have for it. The evidence is far larger than the world has yet noticed. This is what the harpoon meant. It meant that the bottom of the sea is not, as it might appear from the deck of a ferry, an empty place. It is a buried place, a buried country, with its own roads and its own woods and its own children, with its own way of grieving, with its own way of marking the sky, and with, almost certainly, its own version of every story we now think of as ours. Close your eyes for a moment. Let the ship and the deck and the harpoon settle into the dark. Hold only the sound of the slow water against the hull, the small wet noise of a thing being lifted out of cold liquid into colder air. Imagine beneath you a country still asleep. Before there was a sea, there was a country. Before there was a sea, there was a country. But before there was a country, there was an enormous wall of ice. It covered the British Isles almost entirely. It covered most of Scandinavia. It hung in lobes over Ireland and over the eastern North Sea, and where it ended, abruptly, it ended in a pale, shattered cliff of compressed snow. Beyond the cliff, in every direction, was a tundra of frozen silt and rock flour, of crawling streams of meltwater, of low scrubs of dwarf willow flat against the ground, of lichen, of the smell of cold mineral. 20,000 years ago, this is the world we are imagining. The last glacial maximum, the coldest, driest part of the most recent ice age, the high point of the long winter. Across the planet, more water was locked up in ice than at any time since perhaps the previous interglacial. As a direct consequence, the global ocean was lower, much lower, roughly 120 to 130 meters lower than it is today. The reconstructions are now anchored by Hughes, Gillenkreutz, Lohner, Mangerud and Svensson in 2015 to a database of more than 5,000 radiocarbon and cosmogenic dates. The number is not loose. 120 meters is not a small number. 120 meters is the difference between the world you know and a world in which the southern North Sea is not a sea at all. In the place where we are headed, the place beneath the Colinda's Harpoon, there was no water. There was no channel. There was no Strait of Dover. There was, instead, a low, exposed plain of cold ground over which the wind moved in long, unbroken sweeps. To the north, the ice. To the south, the chalk. For a very long time, in fact, Britain had not been an island at all. It had been a peninsula. A peninsula joined to mainland Europe across what is now the Strait of Dover by a long whaleback of chalk known as the Wheeled Artois anticline. The chalk had stood there, more or less stable, for tens of millions of years. It was older than any human. It was older than most things you have a name for. And every time the climate cooled, every time the sea fell, the chalk wall reasserted itself as a piece of overland connection between the future Britain and the future France. Then, about 450,000 years ago, in a cold spell geologists call the Anglian, an ice sheet pushed south into the North Sea. In front of the ice, against the chalk, a vast lake formed. A proglacial lake, fed by the Rhine, the Scheldt and the Thames, three of the largest rivers in northern Europe, draining north and east, dammed by the wall of glacier and the wall of chalk. For perhaps several thousand years, the lake grew. The water rose against the chalk. And then, somewhere along the line of the future channel, the chalk gave. The overflow carved a channel through the anticline, not in a polite, slow, river-cutting way, in a mega-flood. A wall of water hundreds of meters deep moved south at speeds that left, on the bottom of what is now the English Channel, scour marks visible in the modern bathymetry. Some scientists argue that even this was not the final blow. Some argue that the chalk wall held in part, that it was finished off only by a second ice-dammed lake during the MIS 8 or MIS 6 glaciations, around 340,000 or 240,000 years ago. Kim Cohen and Mark Higmer date the final destruction of the Wheeled Artois anticline to the severe Salian glaciation, around 160,000 years ago, ended by a second great meltwater lake some 30,000 years later. The details vary. The arc does not. 3 or 4 times in the deep past, a tongue of ice and a wall of water did the work of detaching the British peninsula from continental Europe. They did not finish the job. They only made the cut. They only carved the future channel into the chalk. Britain, every time the world warmed, became an island. Every time the world cooled, became a peninsula again. Doggerland is the name we give to the last and most recent version of that peninsula, the one that the Mesolithic people knew, and that we, in this century, are slowly learning to know. During the last glacial maximum then, around 20,000 years ago, almost everything on which we are about to walk was either frozen ground or shallow lake or low river-cut plain. The seabed of the future North Sea was a country of cold air. The big rivers, the Rhine, the Thames, the Meuse, the Scheldt, the Seine, did not flow east into a sea because the sea was not there. They merged. They joined into a single, broad, slow river, and they flowed west, along what is now the bed of the English Channel, before reaching the Atlantic somewhere out near the modern continental shelf edge. It is one of the strangest mental images this story will ask of you. Try for a moment to hold it. The Thames does not stop in London. It does not flow into a North Sea estuary. It joins the Rhine. The Rhine, in turn, has met the Meuse and the Scheldt. They have all picked up the Seine. They are running west together on the riverbed that is now the floor of the Channel. Above them, no chalk cliffs, no Dover, no Calais, only a low chalk plain, the beach of the world, scattered with stones and the bones of cold-loving animals. The ice did not stay. It never does. About 15,000 years ago, at the rough start of what climatologists call the Berling-Ellerud interstadial, temperatures in northwest Europe rose fast by something on the order of 7 or 8 degrees Celsius in a few decades. The ice retreated. Plants moved north into ground that had not seen anything but lichen for tens of thousands of years. Along the southern edge of the retreating ice, the old animals began to drift north. Reindeer, mammoth, wild horse, woolly rhinoceros. Some of them you have heard of, some of them you have not. Behind them, at a respectful distance, came the people. People who already knew this kind of land. People who had been hunting these animals for thousands of years in thinner concentrations on the margins of the same long winter. People whose names we have only a few letters of in our own alphabets: Magdalenian, Creswellian, Hamburgian, Federmessergruppen, Ahrensburgian. Phases, categories, slices of stone tool shape. The people themselves, of course, did not know they were any of these things. The ground we are watching, around 12,000 BCE, is not yet Doggerland. It is something colder, harsher, more open. The wider continent of which it is part is sometimes called today the Northwest European Plain. Wide, treeless or nearly so, wind-swept. The kind of land where you can see somebody half a day's walk away, a small black smudge moving across an ochre horizon. The kind of land where the smell of wood smoke can travel 10 kilometres before it is finally lost in the wind. This is the country before our country. A late Pleistocene tundra steppe, a version of northwest Europe that you would not, today, find any close analogue for. No part of modern Britain or France or the Netherlands looks anything like it. It would feel, in the air on your skin, somewhere between coastal Iceland in winter and the high Mongolian steppe. It was not friendly, but it was not hostile either. It was simply itself. A long, open ground for animals, and a small number of patient, skillful people to share. It is worth pausing on the smallness of those numbers. We are talking about a continent in which the entire human population across all of northwest Europe was probably in the low thousands. Not the millions, not the hundreds of thousands, the thousands. Maybe 10,000 people spread across an area larger than several modern countries. A child born into that world might, in their entire life, meet only a few hundred other human beings. The land was empty in a way that the modern mind has trouble accepting. It was not lonely exactly. They had each other, they had the herds, they had the long memory of their kin, but it was empty. It was also dark. Not dark in the modern sense, where there is the small electric glow of distant cities under the cloud at every horizon. Dark in the older sense. Dark like the inside of a cupped hand. At night, on the open plain, with no fire near you, the sky was an absolute thing. Stars to the gravel. The Milky Way a band so bright it cast a faint shadow on snow. Some of those Mesolithic peoples would, in time, draw on bone and on antler what some archaeologists believe to be tally marks of the moon. They knew the sky. The sky was their ceiling and their clock and their first calendar. The sky was the only thing in their world that could be relied on, season after season, to behave the same way. And then, around 10,000 BCE, with the younger Dryas cold snap finally over, the warming returned. This time, it would stick. The forests would come up out of their southern refuges. The big herds would shift again. The ice, which had been ebbing and flowing in a stutter for 1,000 years, would withdraw, slowly, finally, decisively, into Scandinavia and into the high Alps. And on the low ground that is now the southern North Sea, the country we will call Doggerland would begin, properly, to become itself. Kim Cohen, Phil Gibbard and Henk Weerts in 2014 produced paleogeographical reconstructions of the southern North Sea basin spanning the last million years, integrating glacial, fluvial and marine sedimentation into a single landscape evolution framework. Their work makes one thing very plain. The country we are about to meet, temperate, watered, forested, lived in, is not the only version of itself the basin has held. There have been many, cold ones, warm ones, ones with mammoths, ones with elephants, ones with no humans at all. We are looking at the most recent version, the one that, in cosmic terms, ended the day before yesterday. It is a curious fact about the deepest past that almost nothing about it is steady. The ground itself moves. The ice is heavy. When the ice is on the land, the ground beneath it is pressed down. When the ice melts, the ground rises again, slowly, over thousands of years, what geologists call isostatic rebound. The British North is still rising today. The southern North Sea basin, by contrast, is sinking, slowly, gently, in geological time, the way an old mattress sinks under a sleeping body. The sea is not the only thing rising. The land in places is also falling. The two effects meet in the middle. They created the precise conditions in which a continent-sized piece of low land could, over a span of only a few thousand years, become entirely submerged. We are not there yet. We are still in the cold. We are still on the open plain. We are still standing, in our imaginations, on a place where the wind smells of mineral, where the ice glitters at the horizon to the north, and where the only sound for a long time has been the small, dry sound of small, dry things moving across a land that has not yet decided what it is going to be. It is going to be a country. Soon, the first feet would arrive on a land that did not yet know it was doomed. The first feet on Doggerland did not arrive in a single great wave. This is one of the things that the modern story usually gets wrong. It is tempting to imagine, when we hear about the recolonization of Northwest Europe after the ice, a sudden migration, a tide of human bodies pouring up from the south as the glaciers retreated, the way water fills an empty bath. The reality, as Hans Peters and Gary Momber laid out carefully in 2014, is much slower and much more patchy. Successive waves of cultural traditions, Magdalenian, Creswellian, Hamburgian, Federmessergruppen, Ahrensburgian, recolonized the European plain after roughly 13,000 years before present, interrupted more than once by short-lived cold spells. 13,000 years before present. Around 11,000 BCE in calendar years. That is the rough opening date of the human history of what would become Doggerland. The ice has retreated far enough that the land is bearable. The trees have not yet reached this far north. They are still climbing slowly through France, through southern Germany. But the lichen is here. The mosses are here. The big herd animals are here. And the small bands of patient hunter-gatherers, equipped with delicate stone-tipped spears and with the long, deep ancestral memory of how to live this kind of life, are here too. They did not call themselves Magdalenians. They did not call themselves anything we would recognize today. The names we use for them are technical labels, derived from the type sites where their distinctive flint tools were first identified. Magdalenian, from La Madeleine in the French Dordogne. Creswellian, from Creswell Crags in Derbyshire. Hamburgian, from sites near Hamburg in northern Germany. Federmessergruppen, from a German word for a knife-shaped flint blade. Ahrensburgian, from the village of Ahrensburg near Hamburg. These were not separate peoples. They were, more honestly, slightly different ways of making the same kinds of stone tools. Different fashions, different small adaptations, different solutions to the same problems of cold and animal and stone. Underneath, they were all hunter-gatherers from the same broad family of late Ice Age Europeans. The lines between them are real archaeologically, but they are also blurred. A Creswellian camp in Derbyshire would not have looked alien to a Federmesser camp in the Netherlands. Their tools were cousins, so very probably were they. It is worth saying clearly what these people were doing for a living. They were not farming, they were not herding. They were hunting, fishing, gathering. They followed the animals. They watched the sky for the long migration of birds. They knew the rivers the way you know the streets of your own neighborhood. They knew, in some not yet articulate way, that to live on this land, you had to move. You had to read the land. You had to know when to be near the river, when to be away from the river, when to risk the high open ground, when to retreat to the wood. They were, in the truest sense of the word, native to the place. Not in the political sense, in the older, harder sense. They knew where the water was. They knew where the deer would be. They knew how the wind would change. We do not have many of their bones. We have very few. The acid soils of northwest Europe on which they walked are not kind to skeletons. Most of what we know about the people of the late Pleistocene plain comes from their stone tools, their burned hearths, their scattered antler points. Bones, when they survive almost by accident, at the bottom of a peat bog, in a limestone cave, in a layer of cold lake mud where oxygen could not reach. In archaeogenetics, the term for the cultural genetic stream they belong to is Western Hunter-Gatherer, or WHG. It is a distinct ancestral component of modern Europeans, descended from Mesolithic foragers who scattered across Western, Southern and Central Europe after the retreat of the last glacial maximum. It is closely associated with the so-called Villa Bruna cluster, named after a cave specimen in Italy known from the terminal Pleistocene. Most of the people we are about to meet, the people who would walk Doggerland in its last green centuries, are part of this lineage. Their ancestors had survived the ice in southern refugia. Their descendants would, in genetic terms, contribute a small but real piece of every modern Northwest European today. In that sense, this is not a story about strangers. It is a story about a piece of you, a small piece, but a real one. What were they walking into? In the rough years between 11,000 and 10,000 BCE, Doggerland was still cold. The trees were thinking about coming. The deer were already coming. The wide, low plain that today lies under the southern North Sea was probably at this period dotted with shallow lakes, threaded with slow rivers, fringed with sedge and willow. To the north of it, where the ice was still finishing its long withdrawal, the land was even sparser, open tundra still, with hummocks of dwarf birch and patches of bare gravel. By roughly 10,000 BCE, a moment some paleographers call the pre-boreal, the Great Warming had become unmistakable. Trees were arriving in earnest. Birch first, then pine, then behind them, the broad leaves. The Mesolithic, properly so called, was beginning. People who only a few generations earlier had hunted reindeer on open tundra would now learn to hunt red deer and elk in young woodlands. They would learn the names, or at least the songs and stories, of new plants. They would invent new traps for new species. The Doggerland of this moment was not yet the rich estuarine country it would become a few thousand years later. But the seeds of that country were laid down. The river systems were established. The Schotten, that long, now buried watercourse identified by the Birmingham Seismic Project, was already there, draining the southeastern part of the future Doggerbank Highland eastward into what is now the outer Silver Pit Lake. The big rivers, Thames, Rhine, Meuse, Scheldt, Seine, were still flowing west together along the bed of the future channel, but the relative positions of their valleys were already drawn into the soft sediment of the basin. In other words, the geographical bones of Doggerland were present. The flesh, the trees, the animals, the people, the human history, was now beginning to grow over them. It is, to be honest, almost impossible to describe how slow this process was. We talk about it in single sentences. The ice retreated, the trees came, the people followed. Each of those sentences hides several thousand years of patient season after patient season. The trees did not march, they drifted. A new oak grew here, 100 meters beyond the last oak. A new hazel found a foothold there, in a lee out of the wind. The people did not march either. They tested, they probed, they sent out small bands. Some came back, some did not. The frontier of human settlement crept north at the pace of a slow walk, and then a long pause. Slow walk and long pause for hundreds of generations. What was on the other side of that frontier was, by 10,000 BCE, beginning to be remarkable. The north-facing coastal area of Doggerland, that strip of land facing the cold, wide bay that would, much later, become the central North Sea, had a coastline of lagoons, salt marshes, mudflats and beaches. Inland streams, rivers, marshes and lakes filled the interior. By 8000 BCE, it would be, in the words of some of the people who study it now, possibly the most prosperous hunting, fowling and fishing ground in all of Mesolithic Europe. Let that sentence land for a moment. The most prosperous hunting, fowling and fishing ground in Mesolithic Europe. Not a peripheral place, not an outback, not an empty corner. The richest centre of a continent's foragers, in their own terms. It is now the bottom of the southern North Sea. We are not there yet either. We are still walking the cold years. We are still in the centuries when the trees are barely arriving and the herds are barely settling and the people are still few. But we can see, from the air of imagination, what is about to happen. The plain is going to flesh out into a country. The country is going to be settled. The settlement is going to last for thousands of years. And then, in a slow tragedy that none of these people will ever see coming, the country is going to drown. For now, the air is cold. The sky is open. The first feet are arriving in patient ones and twos and small camps. They build small fires of dry willow on dry gravel beside slow rivers. They listen every evening to the wind. They listen in the spring to the birds. Think about that for a moment. The birds matter. In a treeless or near-treeless plain, in a country of huge horizons and small numbers of mammals, birds are everything. They are food in the late spring when the eggs are laid and the chicks are tender. They are food in the autumn when the long migrations bring the geese and the swans down across the marsh edges in their hundreds of thousands. They are clocks. They are calendars. They are messengers between worlds. The arrival of a particular flock of waders means, in the language of the people who learn to read it, that the river is about to thaw. The departure of another flock means the freeze is coming. Cultures all over the late Pleistocene world built whole systems of meaning out of bird arrival and bird departure. It is reasonable to assume that the people walking north into Doggerland did too. There were a great many birds. The mudflats and salt marshes of the Doggerland coast were one of the best stopover habitats for migrating waterfowl in the entire northern hemisphere. The great transatlantic and trans-European flyways converged on this part of the world. In the spring, the tundra geese came up from the south. In the autumn, they went back down. In between, the cranes and swans and ducks and curlews and godwits of every kind one cares to name kept the salt marshes loud every dawn with their small, dry calls. Entire generations of the first Mesolithic people in Doggerland would have spent the soft, warm half of every year hearing that sound. It was the soundtrack of their childhoods. It was, almost certainly, the music of their songs. We have nothing of those songs. We will never have any of those songs. The peat does not preserve singing. But we have, on broken antler points, on flint blades, on the rare scrap of bone in a late glacial cave shelter, the small marks of the animals that were sung about. The geese of Doggerland exist in our records only as a small handful of mineralized wing bones. They sang for a long time. Almost no one heard them. We hear now only the silence after the song. But for the people coming north, the song was just beginning. And they walked into a country full of birds. To understand the birds, we first need to understand the country they sang in. By roughly 9000 BCE, the deep cold of the Younger Dryas had been over for several centuries, and a long warm phase that climatologists call the pre-boreal had taken hold. Trees were marching north into ground that, only a few generations earlier, had been treeless. Birch and pine, the two pioneer trees of post-glacial Europe, were now the dominant cover across most of northwest Europe, including the wide, low ground of Doggerland. A few centuries later, in the boreal climatic phase, broadly 9700 to 7500 BCE, the picture had warmed and softened further. Hazel arrived, oak arrived, elm arrived, lime slowly arrived. By the early Atlantic phase, conventionally dated 8,000 to 5,000 years before present, the picture would be one of broadleaf woodland, of open marsh, of slow rivers, of estuarine bays. This is the world of Mesolithic Doggerland in its prime. Hold the picture for a moment. The country has, by this stage, taken on something like a shape you could see on a map. Out to the southeast, in what is now the Dutch and German plain, the river systems we know today, the Meuse, the Rhine, the Elbe, were already feeding into the wide, low country. Out to the north and east, the country shaded into peninsulas and long, shallow bays. Out to the west, where eventually the open Atlantic would come pouring in, the land was still continuous with what is today the eastern coast of Britain. There was no English Channel in the form we know it. There was instead a long, open river mouth between the chalk of Kent and the sand of Picardy, and beyond it, an even larger plain. What did this country look like in season? The work of paleoecologists, supported now by the sedimentary DNA studies that the Bradford Lost Frontiers team has been pulling out of marine cores, gives us a remarkably specific answer. In spring, the high country of what would later be called the Doggerbank Highland was open hazel and oak woodland, intermixed with scrub and grassy clearings. Ferns, cow parsley of a kind, the wild ancestors of many flowers you would recognize. The lower country to the south and east of the Dogger Highland, in the basin of the Shotten River, was a wide marshland, alternately wet and dry, depending on the season, full of reed beds and sedge and willow scrub. In summer, the marshes were loud. Mosquitoes, certainly. Frogs, certainly. Geese in their thousands, cranes calling at dawn and dusk, otters in the channels, beavers in the side streams, building the slow, elaborate dam systems that beavers have always built, pike in the deeper pools, eel in the sluggish runs. In autumn, the woods turned bronze, the deer rutted, the aurochs, those huge wild cattle, larger than any domesticated animal of their kind, with shoulders standing as tall as a tall man, gathered in the open meadows on the rising land. The wild boar fattened on acorns. The hazelnuts dropped in countless handfuls onto the forest floor. The first frosts came late, in the warmest centuries, but they came. In winter, the country was quieter. The migratory birds had largely left. The deer drew back into the deeper woods. The people, who had spent the warm half of the year following the herds and the migrations, moved into smaller numbers in semi-permanent winter camps. Snow, when it fell, did not fall hard. The Atlantic warmth was already softening the cold. By midwinter, on the lower marshes, there might be only a few inches of snow at a time. The fires would burn low. The hides would lie heavy on the bodies of sleeping children. The fauna of this Mesolithic Doggerland, confirmed in part by the rich preservation conditions at sites like Star Carr, on the shore of the now buried paleolake of Lake Flixton in North Yorkshire, included the herbivores you would expect: red deer, roe deer, elk, aurochs, wild boar, hares, beavers, and the carnivores you would also expect in numbers that today's Europe has long since lost: wolves, lynxes, bears, foxes, pine martens, badgers, hedgehogs. This is one of the harder things for a modern listener to take in. The land we are talking about, the bottom of the present North Sea, supported a fully functional, fully predator-balanced, fully wild ecosystem. Wolves moved between it and modern Britain. Bears denned in its higher woods. Lynxes hunted its rabbits and roe deer. The whole web of relationships that the modern world has by and large broken, between top predators, mid-sized predators, herbivores, and the long, quiet patience of forest soil, was all present. It was, by any measure, one of the richer temperate forest and marsh systems on Earth at that moment. We know this, in part, from the bones. Tens of thousands of fossil bones, mammoths and woolly rhinos from the cold late Pleistocene, and red deer and elk and aurochs and wild boar from the temperate early Holocene have been dragged up by Dutch and British trawlers and beam fishermen since the early 20th century. It is an enormous accidental zoological archive. Every haul of cod or sole pulled out of these waters for over a century has been pulling, in microscopic and not so microscopic ways, on a layer of sediment that contains the bones of two consecutive worlds. Mostly the bones are dropped overboard. Sometimes they go to museums. Sometimes they end up on the kitchen tables of Norfolk grandmothers who do not entirely know what to do with them. The two consecutive worlds are stratigraphically distinct. The cold Pleistocene fauna, mammoth, rhino, hyena, lion, bison, sits in older layers. The warm early Holocene fauna, deer, elk, aurochs, boar, sits above it. Doggerland, in this sense, contains the layered ghost of two ecologies. The first one was tundra. The second one was woodland. Both of them are now, every day, being slightly stirred and slightly turned by the cold currents of the southern North Sea. It is, of course, the second world, the woodland world, the Mesolithic world, that this story is mostly about. That is the world the people knew. That is the world they hunted and fowled and fished in. That is the world they buried their dead in. That is the world they sang about. Let us imagine for a moment what an ordinary morning in that world looked like. A small camp by the side of a slow river, maybe 4 or 5 hide and pole shelters, a central hearth, banked the previous evening, still smouldering in its ash. A dog lies near the warm coals, a real dog, fully domesticated, almost certainly the descendant of late Ice Age wolves. Children sleep in the warmth of the shelters. 2 adults are already up. They walk down the river path, light on their feet, listening. The river is in mist. The reeds drip. From somewhere out on the water, A bittern booms. The walkers know the sound. They smile. The boom of the bittern means a settled marsh. A settled marsh means food. A settled marsh means another good day. Further down the path, one of them stops. The other follows their gaze. Across the channel, perhaps 80 meters away, a young red deer, a yearling stag, lean from the spring, antlers still in soft velvet, has come down to drink. The walkers do not move. They stand. They wait. They watch. The deer does not see them. The deer drinks, lifts its head, walks on. The walkers do not raise a spear, not now. This is not a hunting moment. This is an information moment. They are reading the country. The deer is here, on this side, alone. The water is high enough that the deer chose this crossing. The reeds are bent flat in this place, suggesting that the deer use it regularly. The walkers note all this in some quiet, internal way, without writing anything, because they do not need to write it. They will be back in a week. They will set a snare here, perhaps. They will come at the right time. The deer will run. The deer will sometimes, not always, end up as their winter coat and as their winter meat. This is what hunter-gatherer life on Doggerland looked like, in the simplest version of it. Skill, patience, long memory, detailed knowledge of one place and the people in it, and the animals in it, and the ways everything moved through it across the seasons. This is not a story of a starving fringe of humanity. This is, by the standards of most hunter-gatherer ethnography, a story of comfort, a working food calendar, a long-running pattern, children who grew up, grandparents who taught those children, a culture, not a desperation. By some estimates, the habitable area of Doggerland in this era was on the order of 100,000 square kilometres of countryside, larger than modern Iceland, larger than modern Hungary, comparable to the lowland half of England and the lowland half of the Netherlands combined. Not all of it was equally rich, but enough of it was rich enough that, for many, many generations, perhaps several thousand people at any one time, lived there in a long, stable equilibrium with the land, the animals, and each other. It is hard to overstate how stable that equilibrium was. We are not talking about decades. We are not talking about centuries. We are talking, at the most generous estimate, about a way of life that ran more or less unchanged for 2,500 years on this single landmass. From perhaps 9,000 BCE to perhaps 6,500 BCE. That is roughly the same span of time that separates us today from the oldest pyramids of Egypt, from the founding of writing in Mesopotamia, from the first walls of Jericho. Imagine an entire chain of human history of that length, lived out on a country that no one now living has ever seen, and that is now under the keel of every ferry between Hull and Rotterdam. 1,000 long lives, end to end, in the same wet, good country. 1,000 long lives. Each life perhaps 30 or 40 years on average, with a few elders living longer. Each life full in its small Mesolithic way, with the same things our lives are full of. Hunger and abundance. Children and their grandparents. Sickness and recovery. Loss. Stories. the quiet, repeated work of staying alive in a body. Songs we have lost the lyrics to, names we have lost the sound of. Whole genealogies of who was whose aunt that nobody will ever rebuild. The dust of all that, literally the silt of all that, is now mixed into the bottom of the southern North Sea. We will, in the next chapter, look more closely at the people themselves, at their tools, at their burials, at their cousins on Britain, the Storegga people, the Cheddar people, at what we know faintly of how they thought. For now, hold the country as a whole. A wide, low plain, watered by slow rivers. A coast of lagoons, salt marshes, mudflats and beaches. Inland, marshes and lakes. Birch and oak and hazel and elm. Red deer, elk, aurochs, wild boar. Wolves and bears in the deeper woods. Geese and cranes in the dawn marshes. A few thousand human beings sleeping in their hide shelters by the side of slow rivers, listening to the bittern boom across the reeds. This was their world for 1,000 long lives. Not the simplified hunter-gatherer of children's textbooks, not the cinematic Stone Age caveman in a fur cloak, but the real Mesolithic forager of Doggerland and her near cousins. That is the person we are about to meet. Not a brute, not a noble savage, not a wandering primitive standing in opposition to civilization. Simply a skilled, patient, deeply local human being who knew her country better than most modern people will ever know anything. We have to come at her sideways. We have no diaries from Doggerland, we have no portraits, we have no name written down anywhere of any single individual who lived on that landmass. What we have instead is the cousins. Mesolithic settlements on the surrounding dry land, in northern Britain, in southern Scandinavia, in the Netherlands and in Denmark, that survived because the sea did not come for them. The same cultural traditions, the same flint typologies, the same animal economies, the same broad genetic background. Their cousins are our window. Through that window we can see, with reasonable certainty, the shape of the people themselves. The most famous of these windows is Storegga. Storegga lies today under farmland at the eastern end of the Vale of Pickering in North Yorkshire, about 5 miles south of Scarborough. It is regarded, by most archaeologists, as the most important and most informative Mesolithic site in Great Britain. The reason is preservation. During the Mesolithic, Storegga sat at the western outflow of a long, shallow paleo lake known to archaeology as Lake Flixton. The basin filled by Lake Flixton was probably created by glacial scarring. The lake itself, in the course of the Mesolithic, slowly silted up with peat. And waterlogged peat, as anyone who has ever pulled a bog body out of an Irish bog knows, prevents organic fines from oxidizing. What that means in plain terms is that at Storegga we have, preserved as if by a slow miracle, the parts of a Mesolithic life that almost never survive anywhere else. Wood, bone, antler, bark, birch tar, the fragile, perishable, unwritten layer of human living. Almost everywhere else, all we have are the flints. At Storegga, we have the rest. Current radiocarbon dates indicate occupation between roughly 9,300 and 8,400 BCE, a span of around 8 to 9 centuries. That is, in itself, an extraordinary fact. The same site was used episodically for about as long as the period that separates us today from the founding of the city of Rome. Generations of people came back again and again to the same lake, the same outflow, the same sheltered ground. What have we found there? First, a building. Britain's oldest known house, in fact, identified from post holes and a sunken floor. It was roughly 4 meters across, round, more or less, in the way that a hut put together with bent saplings tends to be. 18 posts have been counted, some of them clearly replaced over time, suggesting that the structure was renewed again and again over a use life of perhaps 200 to 500 years. 200 years is a long time for a single hut to stand. Whatever this place was, it mattered. It was rebuilt. It was returned to. The floor was layered with a soft mat of moss and reeds and other plant materials. Second, a wooden platform, the earliest known carpentry in Europe. Timbers of aspen and willow, split along the grain with wedges, laid down in the boggy edges of the lake to provide firm footing. We do not know exactly what it was for. A landing? A jetty? A ritual platform? A drying floor for fish? Possibly all of those. The point is that someone, 9,000 years before our present era, was splitting timber with skill on a Mesolithic lakeshore. Carpentry has a longer history than we usually give it credit for. Third, the worked antler. 195 barbed points made from the antler of red deer stags. That single number, 195, accounts for more than 95% of the total number of barbed points known from the entire British Mesolithic. Almost all of them were found at one site on the shore of one lake. Some were broken in the breaking. Others, perhaps, were broken on purpose, deposited deliberately into the water as part of some ritual we cannot now reconstruct. Fourth, and the most haunting of all the star-car finds, the antler frontlets. 21 of them. Each is the skull cap of a red deer stag, with the antlers still attached. 2 holes were perforated through each skull with a flint tool. The inside of the skull cap was carefully smoothed. The antlers themselves were trimmed, perhaps to reduce weight. The very plain interpretation is that these were headgear. They were worn. By whom and for what, we do not know with certainty. Hunting disguise? Almost certainly not. You do not need a perforated skull cap with smoothed insides to disguise yourself in the woods. Ritual mask? Probably. The dance of a hunter standing inside the body of his prey is one of the oldest and most widely attested gestures in the human record. The frontlets were also, like the points, often deliberately broken, possibly as part of the ceremony itself. Fifth, the small things. Worked amber, worked shale, hematite, iron pyrites, a tightly rolled piece of birch bark that may be a pendant, the oldest known piece of Mesolithic art in Britain. Small lumps of birch resin tar used as adhesive on tools and probably on body decoration too. The flint that came to Storegga came from nearby beaches and from the Yorkshire wolds immediately to the south. None of the materials had to come from far. Almost everything could be sourced inside the local catchment. This was a self-sufficient place in a self-sufficient country. Sixth, the dead, or at least the very nearly dead. Most Mesolithic burials in northwest Europe are tiny. A few teeth here, a fragment of jaw there, a thigh bone dredged from a bog. Cheddar Man, the male skeleton found in Gough's Cave in Cheddar Gorge in Somerset, dated to the mid to late 9th millennium BCE, is one of the very few well-preserved Mesolithic skeletons we have from Britain at all. He died, by the look of his skull, violently. A large crater-like lesion just above the right orbit suggests that he may also have been suffering from a bone infection. He is exactly contemporary with the early Mesolithic peoples who would have walked Doggerland. When the genome of Cheddar Man was sequenced and reported in the late 2010s, it gave us our first detailed glimpse into the actual genetics of a northwest European Mesolithic forager. Dark skin, blue eyes, dark hair. The pigmentation suite that would have been completely typical for his period and his place. The light skin pigmentation that we, today, associate with Northern Europe was not yet established. Light pigmentation came later, with farming, with different diets, with thousands of years of evolution under cloudier skies. The people of Doggerland, the cousins and contemporaries of Cheddar Man, would have looked, in this respect, much more like a modern North African or West Asian than like a modern Dane. This is a small thing and a large thing at the same time. The people of Doggerland are, in genetic shorthand, Western hunter-gatherers. They are part of a distinct ancestral component of modern Europeans, descended from Mesolithic foragers who scattered across Western, Southern and Central Europe after the retreat of the last glacial maximum ice sheet. Their lineage is closely associated with the so-called Villa Bruna cluster, named after a cave specimen in Italy known from the terminal Pleistocene. They are not strangers to us. They are among our actual ancestors. If we put the Star Car evidence and the Cheddar Man evidence together, and if we think about all the cousin sites all around the rim of the southern North Sea, at Boldner Cliff in the Solent, at Marsflakte off Rotterdam, at Tybrindsvig off Denmark, at Hjørno Vesterhoved also in Denmark, we can begin to sketch, faintly but really, the kind of life that was being lived on the now submerged country itself. Small, semi-permanent camps near reliable food sources, a few houses returned to over generations, a landscape full of remembered places, the deer trail, the eel weir, the hazel grove, the fishing stretch, the gravel beach where flint could be picked up after winter storms. The dominant northern Mesolithic tradition in this period, between roughly 9000 and 6000 BCE, is what archaeologists call the Maglemosian culture. Maglemosian meaning more or less big bog in Old Danish. Its toolkit was characterized by microliths, small composite stone insets, probably mounted in wooden or antler shafts, by ground stone axes for working wood, and by bone and antler tools of all sorts. Its sites are found from the British Isles across the Low Countries into southern Scandinavia. And, very importantly, its tools are found, mixed in with peat and bone, in the sediments dredged up from the floor of the southern North Sea. One notable find is a red deer antler barbed point dredged out of North Sea peat that matches, in technique and style, the Maglemosian groups of southern Scandinavia. The Doggerland people were Maglemosian people. They were not isolated. They were the connecting heart. The Bradford Lost Frontiers project, working with sedimentary DNA pulled from below the seabed, has now confirmed in a 2026 PNAS study what was long suspected. Doggerland was forested. Oak, elm, hazel and lime were present in the basin of the now buried Southern River more than 16,000 years ago, earlier than in surrounding parts of Europe. The country, it seems, was a refugium of warmth, a kind of climatic shelter where temperate trees and the people who depended on them could persist and even flourish a little earlier than they could elsewhere on the continent. It was not a fringe place. It was not a place of last resort. It was, on every measure, a center, a heart. When we say a heart, we are not speaking metaphorically only. There is reason to believe that for thousands of years, the human population of the southern North Sea basin was higher than the human population of any equivalent piece of dry land surrounding it. Doggerland was not the empty country between Britain and Europe. Doggerland was the populated middle. The dry lands around it were, by comparison, more sparsely lived in. The camps on the Norfolk coast, on the Dutch coast, on the Danish coast, faced inland, into Doggerland. They were, in many cases, suburbs of a now submerged main country. Most of the Mesolithic of northwest Europe, then, is missing. Not because the people did not live, but because the place where they lived densest is now underwater. We have only the rim. Imagine if, 2,000 years from now, the entire Mediterranean basin were underwater, and historians had to reconstruct the Roman Empire from the rural villas of the Alps and the small towns of Upper Egypt. They would have a Roman Empire. It would not be wrong. It would simply be missing the center. With Doggerland, that is essentially the situation we are in, which means that almost every well-preserved Mesolithic site we know, Storegga, Boldner Cliff, Hjarnar Vesterhovd, Tibrindvig, is, in some sense, peripheral. The dense center of life, the populous main country, is the part we are not allowed to dig. We are allowed to dig only the borders. We are allowed only to dredge, in slow, patient tonnages, the very top layer of sediment that the trawls and the dredgers reach. Everything we know about Doggerland's people is, in archaeological terms, a margin reading from a missing book. It is also why every new piece of evidence, every harpoon in a piece of peat, every cord DNA sample, every drowned shell midden, every birch tar flint flake, matters more than its size suggests. It is a single word from a vanished page. The sea did not destroy Doggerland's archive. The sea sealed it. Sealed archives eventually are the ones that get reopened. And that heart, by around 6,500 BCE, was beating in a slowly tightening chest. The marshes were creeping inland. The high tides came a little higher every century. The salt water tasted, in the seasonal lagoons, slightly more present than it had a few centuries before. The old people in the camps spoke, sometimes, of the ground their grandparents had known when they were young. The young people did not always understand. The young people had only ever known this land. But the floor of their world was already changing. To understand how a world ends, we first need to understand how a sea begins. The drowning of Doggerland was not a single event. It was, almost the entire way through, a slow process. So slow that no person who was actually living through it would have experienced it as a process at all. They would have experienced it as weather, as an unusually high tide one autumn, as the slight saltiness of a familiar lagoon in a year when their grandparents would not have remembered any saltiness at all, as the loss of one particular hazel grove on the seaward side of a particular island that the family had used for 200 years, as perhaps a story passed down that grandfather, when he was young, used to walk a path that no one now walks because the path is now in the sea. The scientific name for what happened is the Holocene transgression. It is one of the great, quiet events of human prehistory. As the great ice sheets of the last glacial maximum melted across the northern hemisphere, the Laurentide ice sheet over Canada, the Eurasian ice sheet over Scandinavia and parts of Britain, they returned into the world ocean vast volumes of water that had been locked up for tens of thousands of years. The ocean slowly swelled. Sea levels rose, globally, by roughly 120 meters over the course of about 10,000 years. That is, in human terms, a slow rise. About 1 centimeter per year on average, with surges and pauses. About a meter per century. 12 centimeters per decade. The rise was not linear. There were faster pulses, called meltwater pulses, when sections of the great ice sheets calved more rapidly. There were slower phases when the ice was sluggish and the ocean nearly still. But over the long view, the rise was relentless. For Doggerland, this rise translated directly into the slow loss of land. Fraser Sturt, Duncan Garrow and Sarah Bradley produced in 2013 a remarkable set of paleogeographical reconstructions of Britain, Ireland and the northwest French coast at 500-year intervals from 11,000 calendar years before present to the present day. If you were to flick through their maps in sequence, like the pages of a flipbook, you would see Doggerland at the start as a continuous wide piece of dry country joining Britain to Europe. Then, slowly, you would see saltwater fingers reaching in along the river estuaries. You would see the central plain divided. You would see 2 large islands form. Then several. Then, by around 6,500 BCE, you would see Britain itself separate, finally, from the European mainland. The British peninsula, after 100,000 years of stuttering attachment, becomes a British island. The Dogger Bank itself, an upland area of Doggerland, remained an island for considerably longer than the rest, until at least 5,000 BCE by current estimates. The high ground does not give up. The high ground waits. But even the Dogger Bank was eventually low enough that the rising sea took it as well. Today, it is a shallow underwater plateau, roughly the size of Wales, sitting 18 meters or so beneath the surface of the central North Sea. The transgression was not just a matter of the ocean rising. The land was also moving. Once the immense weight of the Eurasian ice sheet began to melt off Scandinavia and northern Britain, those northern areas, no longer pressed down by ice, began slowly to rebound. The lithosphere is not infinitely rigid. The Earth's mantle, on geological timescales, behaves like a very stiff liquid. The land in northern Britain has been rising for 10,000 years. It is still rising today, at rates of a few millimeters per year. The southern North Sea, by contrast, has been sinking. It is not directly under any glacial load any longer, but it is part of a wider crustal system in which what comes up in one place tends to come down somewhere else. The basin tilts. The southern margin of Britain is today sinking at a rate of about 1 to 2 millimetres per year. Doggerland, in its last centuries, was caught between two effects: a rising ocean and a slowly sinking land. The two together produced a relative sea level rise that in places must have outpaced the global average. The paleo-ecological signs of this come in many forms. Salt-tolerant plants begin to appear in pollen records on the seaward side of the country. Brackish water diatoms, tiny silica-shelled algae, replace freshwater species in lakebed cores from drowned wetlands. The peat layers grow thicker, then are interrupted by marine clays, then thicker still. Each transition is a small disaster for some community of plants and animals, and a small opportunity for some other community. For the people, the impact would have been gradual but cumulative. The northern coast slowly fragmented into salt marsh archipelago. The central plain shrank. By around 8000 BCE, large portions of Doggerland had become a complex of low-lying islands separated by shallow channels. Some of those islands were still rich in resources, better in some ways than the old continuous mainland, because rich estuarine and intertidal zones tend to be among the most productive feeding grounds in any temperate landscape. Mesolithic peoples, who already had boats, we know this from the discovery of Mesolithic dugout canoes preserved in waterlogged deposits in Denmark and the Netherlands, would have adapted over generations to a more island-based, more boat-using way of life. But the islands kept shrinking. We should pause for a moment over the climate background. Around 8,200 years ago, so around 6,200 BCE, there was a sudden, sharp climate event known to specialists as the 8.2 kiloyear event. It was a rapid drop in global temperatures, lasting somewhere between 2 and 4 centuries. Atmospheric methane fell by about 80 parts per billion, a 15% reduction, suggesting a broad cooling and drying trend across the northern hemisphere. It was not as severe as the younger Dryas of 3 or 4 millennia earlier, but it was significant. The most widely accepted cause is the catastrophic drainage of an enormous glacial lake in North America, Lake Agassiz, the meltwater body that had been ponding to the south of the retreating Laurentide ice sheet into the North Atlantic. When the ice dam holding Lake Agassiz finally gave, somewhere around 6,200 BCE, an enormous freshwater pulse poured into the ocean. The fresh water disrupted the meridional overturning circulation that drives the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream weakened. Northwest Europe got colder. For Doggerland's last people, this was a hard turn at exactly the wrong moment. Their islands were already shrinking. Their winters were already creeping in. And now, suddenly, the climate was a few degrees colder for a few generations, and the long, warm boreal phase was being replaced by the cooler, wetter, unsettled early Atlantic. It is also the climate window in which the most spectacular event of all of Doggerland's history took place. We will get to that event next. We will treat it carefully because the science around it has changed substantially in the last few years. But first, take in the pace of the long drowning, because the long drowning is the real story. The long drowning lasted roughly 3,000 years, from around 10,000 to 7,000 years before present. 3,000 years, give or take. 150 human generations. The British and the European mainland did not come apart in a violent night. They came apart in slow centuries. By 6500 BCE, the channel between Britain and the continent was effectively complete. The British Mesolithic, the Mesolithic of Storegga, of Cheddar Gorge, of the Pennine Moors, would now go its own quieter island way, while the continental Mesolithic, the Maglemosian, then the Kongomoser, then the Ertabuller in southern Scandinavia, went its way. It is one of the genuinely strange facts of British history that the moment Britain became an island has a date. Not 1066, not 410, not even prehistoric. Around 6500 BCE, which is, in the long view, the day before yesterday, the slow tide finally cut Britain off. Every British person alive after that date is, in this small geological sense, the inheritor of an island. The mainland of Europe, from then on, is a place reachable only by boat. There are, even now, some scientists who argue for an alternative version of the story, in which the long drowning was not the only mechanism. They argue that, at some moment in the late drowning, perhaps after the Storegga slide tsunami had already devastated low-lying coasts, the second drainage of Lake Agassiz raised global sea levels by perhaps a meter or more in only a few years, and the last vestiges of Doggerland disappeared in a relatively rapid pulse. Other scientists argue against. The debate is unresolved. Either way, the broad outline is the same. Slow loss of land, sharp climate event, final inundation by some combination of long-running sea level rise and short-running catastrophic events around the 8.2 kiloyear horizon. It is worth thinking for a moment about what it must have been like to live through the slow loss of a country whose ending you could not name. We live in a culture saturated with the language of climate change and sea level rise. We have charts, we have models, we have words for what is coming. The people of Doggerland had none of that. They had only memory. And memory, on the scale of a Mesolithic life, is short. A grandparent might tell a grandchild, "When I was your age, the marsh used to extend much further out, and there was good fowling at a place we called something." By the time the grandchild told that story to their own grandchild, the place would already be a salt marsh, no good for the same kind of fowling. 3 generations is 6 or 7 decades. In 6 or 7 decades, on a slowly drowning country, perhaps a kilometre of coastline can disappear. Not all at once, in small annual losses, each loss small enough that no one quite called it a disaster. This is one of the things about the slow drowning that is hardest to name. There were no refugees. There were no mass migrations. Anthropologists would not have been able to identify at any given moment a Doggerland diaspora. The people simply, in each generation, made small adjustments. They moved their winter camp slightly inland. They learned a new river. They abandoned a particular hazel grove. They made boats. They taught their children to make boats. The boats got better. By the time Britain finally separated from the continent, perhaps 30 or 40 generations of Doggerlanders had already migrated in small steps into the dry margins around the basin. Their descendants are today scattered across the modern Mesolithic record of Britain, the Netherlands, Denmark, Belgium, and northern France. The Maglemosian and Kongamose and early Erteböller cultures of southern Scandinavia, the British Mesolithic of the moors and the river terraces, these are the surviving relatives of a culture whose centre is now under the sea. They carried the country with them. They carried its songs and its names and its ways of cooking eel. We just cannot read most of those any longer. For most of those 3,000 years, life on Doggerland would have continued. Children would have been born. Old people would have died. Camps would have moved, season after season, generation after generation. The shape of the country would have changed gradually, but each individual generation would have known their version of it as the only version. Their grandparents had said, perhaps, that there used to be more land out there in the west. The grandchildren would say the same thing again, 2 generations later, about a different patch of the same country. The slow drowning kept its rhythm. The people kept their rhythm. They did not know that the world, in its long view, had decided to take their country back from them. They did not know either what was forming around 8,200 years before present on the slope of the Norwegian continental shelf far to the north of them. They did not know that in the deep, cold mud, gas was building. They did not know that an old earthquake on a fault we cannot now identify with certainty was about to deliver one shock too many. They did not know that somewhere out beyond their northern horizon, a piece of seafloor the size of a small country was about to slide. They were sleeping, perhaps, in their small camps, or quietly making evening meals, or laying down under the smoke vent of a small reed-and-hide shelter, watching the smoke climb up to the dark roof beam. And then, one ordinary evening, the sea moved fast. What happened that ordinary evening was that somewhere along the seabed off the western coast of Norway, the world cracked open. The Storegga slides, and the name comes from a Norwegian phrase meaning simply the Great Edge, are among the largest known submarine landslides anywhere on Earth. They are visible today in deep-sea bathymetric maps of the Norwegian Sea as a series of vast, curved scars carved into the seabed at the edge of Norway's continental shelf, roughly off the Møre coast. There were 3 of them, separated by tens of thousands of years. The first occurred during the Pleistocene, long before any humans were anywhere near Doggerland. The second, by far the most consequential for human history, occurred sometime around 6,200 BCE. The third was a much smaller, late event. It is the second one we are concerned with, the second Storegga slide. What exactly slid? Carbon dating of plant material recovered from sediment deposited by the resulting tsunamis places the event quite tightly, somewhere between roughly 6,225 and 6,170 BCE, a window of about half a century. The slide itself involved the catastrophic failure of an enormous segment of Norway's continental shelf. The estimated total volume of debris is staggering, measured in thousands of cubic kilometres of sediment. The length of coastal shelf involved is itself measured in hundreds of kilometres. This is not a small Earth movement. It is, by mass, one of the largest geological events of the entire Holocene anywhere on Earth. The seafloor itself, in a region the size of a small country, simply gave way and slid into the deep Norwegian Sea. The trigger is debated, but the leading hypothesis combines two factors. First, glacial sediment, trillions of tons of it, that had been carried over thousands of years of melting off the Scandinavian ice sheet and dropped at the edge of the continental shelf. Layers and layers of unstable, water-saturated mud accumulated in a precarious slope. Second, an earthquake, the trigger that actually destabilized the system. There is also a third proposed contributor, methane clathrate, a solid compound consisting of large amounts of methane suspended in a crystal water structure that forms in deep oceans under extremely high pressure.
If methane clathrate is removed from a high-pressure, low-temperature environment, 1 cubic meter of solid clathrate can expand to roughly 164 cubic meters of gaseous methane. If this expansion occurred in the underlying sediments at depth, it would weaken the integrity of the surrounding rocks sufficiently to trigger or to massively amplify the slide. Somewhere in the deep, cold mud, then, something snapped. When a mass of seafloor that large suddenly slides downslope, it pushes the water above it. That push becomes a wave. The wave radiates outward from the source in concentric rings, propagating across the open sea at speeds of several hundred kilometers per hour, almost imperceptible in deep water, but slowing, steepening, and growing in height as it approaches shallower coasts. The Storegga tsunami did exactly this. It propagated south and west across the North Atlantic and the North Sea. In Scotland, traces of it have been recorded in sediment cores. The tsunami deposit has been found in the Montrose Basin and in the Firth of Forth, in places several kilometers inland from the modern coast and several meters above current normal tide levels. A 2023 numerical modelling study by Patrick Sharrocks and John Hill found run-up heights of up to 3 to 6 meters around mainland UK. At Howick in Northumberland, the site of a known Mesolithic settlement, their model estimated that when the wave arrived at high tide, the mortality within the resource-rich intertidal zone could have been up to 100%. A 2024 study by Stein Bondevik and colleagues, published in Nature Communications, simulated the maximum tsunami flow velocities at 2 to 5 meters per second on the shelf offshore Western Norway, and up to about 1 meter per second down to a water depth of 1,000 meters. They also showed that the sediments long used to reconstruct the 8.2 kilo-year climate cooling event have been partially reworked by the tsunami, meaning that the climate record itself is, in places, contaminated by the wave. For the people of Doggerland, what was left of them at this point on a fragmenting archipelago of low islands, the tsunami arrived without warning. There were no early warning networks. There were no seismic alarms. The wave came in across an open coast that by this point was mostly mudflat and reed and shallow water. The hypothesis that has been on the table since the 1990s is that the Storegga tsunami catastrophically flooded much of the remaining low country, and that, in human terms, up to a quarter of the Mesolithic population of Britain may have lost their lives in it. The number is rough. It is also, almost certainly, the headline number that fixed itself in popular memory. The more recent science, however, is a great deal more cautious. In 2020, a paper in the journal Antiquity by James Walker, Vincent Gaffney, Simon Fitch, Merle Muru, Andrew Fraser, Martin Bates and Richard Bates dated the Storegga tsunami to around 8,150 years before present, and presented the first direct evidence of the tsunami in the southern North Sea, but argued that traditional notions of a single, catastrophically destructive event need rethinking. Their patchy sediment evidence suggested an event smoothed and redeposited rather than universally lethal. Local topographic variation mattered enormously. A community on a low coastal flat would have been devastated. A community a few kilometers inland or behind a slight rise might have experienced only flooding without major mortality. Some lowland communities and their archives, they argued, may very well have survived. A 2014 study, in the same vein, suggested that the only remaining parts of Doggerland by the time of the Storegga slide were already low-lying islands, and supported the view that those areas had already been substantially abandoned by the time of the wave. That is to say, by the time the wave arrived, much of the population had already migrated to the dry rims of the basin. The wave did not so much depopulate Doggerland as it did finish off the last small coastal communities still clinging to the highest islands. Which version is right? The honest answer is, we do not yet know. The science is still developing. The 2024 contamination paper by Bondevik and colleagues complicates the older estimates because it shows that what we thought were independent climate signals were partly tsunami signals. The 2023 Northumberland modelling study by Sharrocks and Hill suggests that, at certain coastal sites at the right tide phase, the wave could have been very nearly total in its lethality. The 2020 Walker-Gaffney paper suggests that, across the wider basin, the picture was more uneven. What is reasonably certain is this. Sometime around 6,200 BCE, a wave large enough to leave sediment several meters above modern tide levels in Scotland surged through the southern North Sea basin and onto the coastlines of Britain, the Netherlands, Denmark, and northern Germany. Mesolithic settlements on the immediate coast were probably wiped out where they sat. People who happened to be inland survived. People who happened to be on the lowest islands of the disintegrating Doggerland, who had not migrated, did not. In Northumberland, Sharrocks and Hill's modelling suggests another effect, not always discussed. The wave inundated a large stretch of coast and would have destroyed key autumn resources, including hazelnuts, an essential winter staple across northern Britain. If the wave hit in late summer or autumn, just before the harvest, the loss of that food source could have led to mass winter starvation in the months that followed, even in communities that themselves were not directly drowned. The radiocarbon record across northern Britain in the centuries immediately after the wave shows a measurable population dip. That dip has been interpreted by some as the indirect tsunami signature, not the wave itself, the winter that came after the wave. It is also worth saying that the wave is not the reason Britain became an island. The wave struck a country that was already mostly underwater. Britain was already nearly separate from the continent. Dogger Bank had already become an island. The wave was not the pivot. The wave was the punctuation. The pivot was the slow, long drowning we have been describing for the last few thousand years of imagined time. In the language of the people themselves, of course, none of this would have been theory.
It would have been an evening of cold spray and cold, dark water. A wall of grey, taller than a man. A small camp on a low island, vanishing in a single breath. A boat lost. A child lost. A grandfather lost. The next morning, the survivors picking through driftwood. Salt where there had been freshwater wells. Salt where there had been hazel groves. Salt where there had been a particular path that the family had used for 200 years. They did not know they were the last generation. Some of them were not the last generation. Some of them lived. Some of their children survived. The cousins on the Norfolk coast, on the Dutch coast, on the Danish coast, in the upper Rhine valleys, took some of them in. New camps formed on dry ground. New songs were made. The story of the dark water passed perhaps in some form through several generations before the words of it slowly slipped away. It is also worth taking a quiet look at how the science has changed over the last 40 years. When the Storegga tsunami hypothesis first took shape in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the picture was simpler. There were peat layers in Scotland with marine sand on top of them. There was a date, more or less, around 8,000 years before present. There was a known submarine landslide on the Norwegian shelf. The simplest interpretation was that a great wave had once swept across the North Sea, drowned a now vanished landmass, and depopulated huge stretches of coast in a single afternoon. It was a clean, memorable story. For about 20 years, that is what most people heard. The wave came, the country drowned. A quarter of Mesolithic Britain died. Then, as more sediment cores were taken and more numerical models built, the picture started to get messier. The Storegga sediments turned out, on close inspection, not to be everywhere. Some sites had clear tsunami deposits, complete with the characteristic upward fining sand sequence, the displaced shells, the broken vegetation. Other sites where the simple story said the wave should have arrived in full force, had no tsunami deposit at all. Either the wave had not arrived there, or the deposit had been eroded by later tides, or the local topography had channeled the wave around them. The Walker-Gaffney 2020 paper, built on direct cores from the central southern North Sea, made this complexity unmistakable. The southern North Sea sediment record showed only patchy, small, locally variable tsunami signatures, not the unbroken devastation of the older popular telling. Local topographic variation, the authors argued, mattered as much as the wave itself. Communities on a low coastal flat were devastated. Communities a few kilometres inland, or behind a slight rise, may have experienced only flooding with limited mortality. The Bondevik 2024 paper, taking a quite different angle, looked at the 8.2 car climate cooling event and showed that the very sediments long used as a climate signal were partially reworked by the Storegga wave itself. In other words, the wave had not just affected human populations, it had also corrupted the geological archive that scientists were using decades later to read the climate at all. Some of what looked like a much harsher North Grippian cold snap turned out to be redeposited older sediment dragged into younger contexts by tsunami currents. The climate recovered, in some reconstructions, looked colder than it actually was because the wave had reshuffled the deck. What the science has done, in other words, is take a clean, dramatic story and turn it into a cloudier, more honest, more distributed story. The wave was real. The wave was huge. The wave killed people. The wave was not, however, the only or even the main reason for Doggerland's end. The drowning was the slow main thing. The wave was the dramatic but uneven punctuation. This is, in fact, a pattern in much of archaeology. The dramatic single events that capture the public imagination almost always turn out, on close inspection, to be sitting on top of a longer, slower process that did most of the actual work. The single evening version is easier to remember. The truth, almost always, is a slower thing in many smaller pieces. For the Mesolithic people who lived through it, of course, the difference between the dramatic version and the slow version mattered very much. The wave that took your village was not less real because the basin-wide pattern looked patchier than the older models suggested. The local lived experience and the basin-wide statistics are two different scales. Both are true. By 6000 BCE, the Maglemosian culture was being succeeded in southern Scandinavia by the Congomosa. By 5000 BCE, the Congomosa was giving way to the Ertaberla. The Mesolithic continued. The country, however, did not. The survivors went on, not knowing how the story would be told. The story would be told, in the end, 8,000 years late. It would be told slowly. It would be told quietly. It would be told first by the things that the sea kept giving back without being asked. The tusks, the bones, the harpoons, the lumps of peat. It would be told later by the people who learned how to listen to those gifts. And it would be told decisively by a small number of patient researchers who, in the closing decades of the 20th century and the opening decades of the 21st, decided that the time had come to actually go and look. In 1915, the anatomist Sir Arthur Keith published his book The Antiquity of Man, and asked, in the careful prose of an Edwardian gentleman, whether the sea floor of the southern North Sea might still hold the traces of the people who had once walked it. He preempted by decades the modern recognition of a drowned prehistoric continent. Almost nobody at the time took the question literally. The North Sea was, for almost everyone, a piece of fishery and weather, not a piece of human prehistory. For most of the 20th century, that remained the case. Trawlermen pulled up bones and harpoons and were, in the main, ignored. The few archaeologists who took the bones seriously, Clement Reid, the writers of the catalogue of Maglemosian bone and antler implements from the North Sea and from the Netherlands, published in 1970, were specialists working at the margins of public attention. The country beneath the water was, in most British and continental textbooks, a footnote, a curiosity, not a place. This began to change in the 1990s. The change had a name. The name was Bryony Coles. Bryony Coles is a British archaeologist who, in a 1998 paper published in the journal Antiquity, gave the lost country a single short word that nothing in the world had until then provided: Doggerland. After the Dogger Bank, after the Dutch fishing boats called doggers, clinker-built, patient, slow, that had given the bank its modern name.
after the long, quiet recognition that something that vast and that important deserved to be called something. Coles also drew, in the same paper, the first speculative gazetteer of that country's lost rivers and coasts. Maps, names, a first imagined geography. It was a small act in a quiet journal. It changed the way the world thinks about that piece of sea. Naming a place is not the same as discovering it. The sea floor under the southern North Sea was already, in 1998, a quietly busy place, full of oil and gas exploration crews running 3D seismic surveys, full of fishery scientists doing surveys of fish stocks, full of marine geologists mapping sandbank dynamics for shipping channels. There was, in other words, an enormous amount of data already being collected about that piece of seabed. What had been missing was the question. Once the country had a name, the question became thinkable. What did the rivers of Doggerland look like? Where were its hills? Where were its lakes? Where had the people lived? Between 2003 and 2007, a team at the University of Birmingham, led by Vincent Gaffney and Ken Thompson, asked exactly that question, with exactly the data the oil industry had been gathering. They obtained access to industrial 3D seismic survey data, originally collected by Petroleum Geoservices for hydrocarbon exploration, and they reprocessed it for archaeology. The numbers are staggering. They mapped roughly 23,000 square kilometres of early Holocene landscape, the size of Wales, more or less, the size of Massachusetts, an entire submerged country, rendered layer by buried layer as a digital landscape on a screen. What the seismic showed was a prehistoric country with the same kind of features any normal country has: river valleys, floodplains, tributary networks, estuarine bays, hill ridges, salt marshes, lakes. The data was good enough to give specific features specific names. They named the long, now buried river system that drained the southeastern part of the Doggerbank Highland after Frederick William Schotten, the great Birmingham geologist whose own work had been foundational in British Quaternary studies. The Schotten River. They named a system of dunes above the Schotten the Spines. They named a basin between two huge sandbanks the Outer Silver Pit. They confirmed the upland of the Doggerbank itself. For the first time in the long history of human knowledge, a Mesolithic country that had been underwater for 8,000 years had a map. Not a complete map, not a final map, but a map, with named places, with drawn boundaries, with a real geography. In 2012, the results of a study of Doggerland by the universities of Birmingham, St Andrews, Dundee and Aberdeen, including surveys of artefacts, were displayed at the Royal Society Summer Exhibition in London. It was the first major public showcase of the seismic mapped landscape. Tens of thousands of visitors came through. Many of them, walking out, would have been the first members of their families to learn that there was such a place as Doggerland ever in the human past. In 2013, the European Heritage Prize was awarded jointly to M. Daniel Terran and to Vincent Gaffney by the European Association of Archaeologists for the Mapping Doggerland project, the first formal recognition by Europe that the continent's drowned heart was, properly, a piece of European cultural inheritance. There had also been, in 2007, a piece of mainstream British television. Channel 4's Time Team broadcast the documentary Britain's Drowned World in 2007, with technical advice from Vincent Gaffney and presented by Tony Robinson. It was the first popular television introduction of Doggerland to a mass British audience. After Time Team, ordinary people started to know about it. Schools started to teach it. Museum curators started to design exhibits around it. The country, slowly, became part of the cultural record again. Meanwhile, the science kept going. Since 2015, the University of Bradford's Europe's Lost Frontiers project, led again by Vincent Gaffney, has continued mapping the prehistoric landscapes of Doggerland and has used this data to direct a program of extensive coring of marine paleochannels. Sediment from the cores has provided sedimentary DNA and conventional environmental data. These are now feeding into a major computational modeling program replicating the colonization of the submerged landscape. It is, in a sense, the largest and most ambitious archaeological mapping project in the world. It is mapping, slowly, an entire missing country. In 2016, Tizard and colleagues mapped a Mesolithic case study area within the southern North Sea, the so-called white ribbon between the intertidal and the offshore zones, using high-resolution geophysical survey to recover Holocene paleogeography in unprecedented detail. In 2007, Gaffney, Thompson and Fitch published the technical monograph Mapping Doggerland, the Mesolithic Landscapes of the Southern North Sea, the foundational book of the new field. A few years later, a more accessible, popular book on the same project followed. Both are still in print. Both are, as of this writing, the canonical reference for anyone wanting to study the basin in detail. We should also pause to acknowledge a slightly different but related strand of the work that has been done on dry land on the sites that closely resemble the lost Doggerland sites we cannot dig. The Tybrin Vig site off Denmark, submerged in shallow Baltic water, preserved late Mesolithic Ertabuller dugout canoes, paddle blades carved with intricate designs, and worked textiles, illustrating the maritime adaptations of post-Doggerland Mesolithic peoples. The Tybrin Vig finds are, in effect, our window into what the people who left Doggerland behind had become by the time the country itself had finished disappearing. And the Maglemosian to Congomosa to Ertabuller cultural sequence, dated in southern Scandinavia between roughly 9000 and 4000 BCE, traces the slow cultural consequences of a people losing their main heartland and adapting to a more island and coast world. This is the part of the story that is most surprising in some ways. The Mesolithic did not end with Doggerland. The Mesolithic continued. The cultures of the Rim, the Starcarians, the Maglemosians, the Congomosians, the Ertabullians, went on. They learned to live without their heartland. They invented new tools. They invented new boats. They invented new ways of fishing. They built shell middens, vast accumulations of mussels and oysters and whelks that survive on coastlines from Denmark to Britain to the Hebrides. Some of those shell middens, like the one at Hjarnø Vesterhoved that we will look at more closely in the next chapter, are themselves now underwater. The transgression did not stop. The Mesolithic kept being slowly drowned, century after century, until, in the end, the rest of European history walked over its remaining bones. It is also worth saying clearly what kind of work this is in the day-to-day texture of the people who do it. It is not the fast-cut excitement of a television program. It is mostly slow, patient screen work. A graduate student in a dim office in Bradford or Birmingham, sitting in front of a high-resolution monitor for 10 hours a day, scrolling through grey and blue, colour-coded seismic slices, looking for the slight curve of a river bend or the slight wedge of an old delta. A coring technician on a research vessel, pulling up 2-metre cylinders of mud, labelling them, stowing them in cold storage for the trip home. A geneticist in a clean air room, teasing trace amounts of degraded DNA out of clay that has not seen the sun in 8,000 years. A radiocarbon laboratory, slowly, accurately, dating a single fragment of birch tar to within a window of about 100 years. The work is methodical. It is unglamorous. It is one of the great, slow projects in current archaeology. It is also, at this point, an international and inter-institutional project on a scale most other archaeological topics never reach. Universities of Bradford, Birmingham, St Andrews, Dundee, Aberdeen, Exeter, Ghent, Leiden, Aarhus, Copenhagen, Hamburg, the European Maritime Atlas, the Splashcos European Network, the North Sea Prehistory Research and Management Framework, national museums across the rim, private oil and gas companies who 20 years ago would not have imagined that their seismic data would feed an archaeology of the Mesolithic. They all, in different ways, contribute to the slow rebuilding of the missing country. What the modern science has done, then, is more than recover a name. It has recovered an actual landscape. River valleys, hills, lakes, marshes, named features. It has recovered, in faint but increasingly readable form, the actual environments those Mesolithic people walked in. It has recovered, through sedimentary DNA, the trees and the animals that lived among them. It has recovered, through underwater survey at Hjarno and Tibrind and Marsflakta and Boldner Cliff, scattered fragments of their material lives. And it is, slowly, recovering the basin-wide picture as a whole. The country had learned to speak again, slowly, in data. On a Dutch beach near the Hook of Holland, on a quiet, overcast morning in October of 2012, a retired schoolteacher walks along the tide line. The sand is fresh. It has been pumped only a few weeks earlier by a vast hopper dredger working 20 kilometres offshore, sucking sediment from the sea floor and depositing it in a long line on the coastal strip as a measure of coastal defence. The Dutch call this kind of construction a sand engine, a soft, engineered shoreline. Marsvlakte and Zandmotor are the two best known. They protect the lowland Netherlands from storm surges by giving the sea something soft to chew. The sea takes the sand, slowly, year by year, and lays it back along the eroding coast. The schoolteacher knows what to look for. Many beachcombers along this stretch of coast do by now. They know that the sand from the dredgers is not local sand. They know it has been lifted from the sea bottom, from a layer of sediment that, 20,000 years ago, was the floor of a dry country. They know that, in the sand, sometimes, there are bones. She finds that morning 2 pieces. The first is a fragment of mammoth tusk, slightly curved, ivory-coloured, rounded by the mill of the dredger. The second is something smaller, more puzzling. A tooth, old, heavy, definitely human. She bags both. She takes them to a local museum. The museum confirms, yes, the tusk is mammoth. Yes, the tooth is human. The tooth is, in this case, probably Mesolithic, probably from a person who lived perhaps 8,000 or 9,000 years ago on a piece of land now several meters beneath the keel of any container ship moving through the lanes off Rotterdam. This kind of find is no longer especially rare. Maasvlakte and the Zandmotor have been spreading Doggerland sediments across modern beaches for 20 years. Amateur beachcombers in Holland regularly find Mesolithic and Paleolithic bone tools. There are field guides, there are online communities, there are local archaeological societies. The sea, very politely, gives up its bones, and ordinary people walk along the beach and pick them up. It is one of the strangest forms of archaeology in the world. There is no excavation. There is no trench. There is no formal site grid. The site is the entire seabed. The excavator is a coastal defense dredger. The trowel is the pair of eyes of a retired schoolteacher who has time on a quiet October morning and a slow walking pace.
And yet, year after year, the finds accumulate. Scientific papers are published from them. Museum collections grow. The basin slowly relinquishes more of itself. Not every find is small. In 2009, a skull fragment of a Neanderthal, dated at over 40,000 years old, was recovered from material dredged from the Middle Deep, some kilometres off the coast of Zeeland, and exhibited in Leiden. It was the first identifiable Neanderthal remain to be recovered from the floor of the southern North Sea. It was proof, if any more were needed, that the country we now call Doggerland had been inhabited not just by Mesolithic foragers in the early Holocene, but in earlier interglacials by Neanderthals. The basin has been, on and off, a country for hundreds of thousands of years. In 2019, a flint flake, partially covered with birch bark tar, was dredged up off the Dutch coast. Direct material evidence of Neanderthal adhesive technology preserved in Doggerland sediments. The find was modest in size. It was profound in implication. It showed that even on the now submerged seabed, individual bits of Neanderthal manufacture survive in identifiable form. It also showed that the cognitive sophistication of late Neanderthal toolmakers was as high as the more famous evidence on dry land had already suggested. They knew how to render birch bark into adhesive. They knew how to apply it with care. The piece that came up from the sea was not different in quality from pieces found in Neanderthal caves on dry land in the Eifel or the Rhineland. The seabed is, in this sense, a sealed continuation of the same record. In 2019, a separate team from Bradford and Ghent recovered a hammerstone flint on the seabed off the coast of Cromer, Norfolk, from a depth that suggests it came from a once dry Mesolithic working surface. Not a stray dropped tool, an in situ working surface. The implication is that somewhere down there, an actual Mesolithic camp survives, in some form, beneath the modern sediment. Not yet excavated, not yet fully mapped, but there, waiting. Further afield, the closest analogue to what a future Doggerland excavation might look like is the underwater Mesolithic site
of Hjerne Vesterhoved in Denmark. In 2021, Peter Astrup and colleagues published a paper verifying it as one of the first underwater Ertabuller shell middens to be systematically confirmed as a genuine anthropogenic shell deposit. Hjerne Vesterhoved is dated to between 5,400 and 5,100 BCE.
It is one of the earliest such Ertabuller middens in Denmark, and the fact that it now sits a few meters below the present sea level reminds us, quite forcefully, of how much late Mesolithic Europe is hidden beneath modern water. Underwater shell middens are, in some ways, the closest thing the slow drowning has left us to a Mesolithic settlement that was simply caught and sealed beneath the rising sea. The Hjerne deposit was not destroyed. The shells, the burned wood, the small worked bone tools sat for 7,500 years on a quiet patch of seabed and came up in 2018 and 2019 dives more or less intact. Their preservation gives an unusually fine-grained picture of late Mesolithic coastal subsistence. What people ate, in what proportions, in what season, prepared in what kinds of fires. It is the kind of evidence Doggerland itself probably still holds in places beneath its sealing sediment. There is also a 2007 internationally significant early Middle Paleolithic stone tool assemblage that was recovered through aggregate dredging off the Norfolk coast, associated with the floodplain deposit of the now submerged Paleo-Yar river system. The dredged tools, again, were not in their original positions, but they were sufficiently well preserved to identify as a single, coherent assemblage. They date back to a much older interglacial, to a time before any of the people we have been describing in this story had walked the basin at all. Doggerland, in other words, is not just a Mesolithic story. It is a stratigraphy of human settlement that goes back hundreds of thousands of years, all of which is now beneath the same modern sea. The larger picture is one of a slowly opening archive. In 2020, a major open-access volume entitled The Archaeology of Europe's Drowned Landscapes, edited by Jeff Bailey, Nena Galanidou and Hans Peters, brought together submerged landscape evidence from across the continent under the framework of the Splashcos European network. It is the closest thing the field has to a unified atlas. The book covers Doggerland in its proper context, as the largest and most spectacular of Europe's submerged Mesolithic landscapes, but only one of many. The same processes that drowned Doggerland drowned, on smaller scales, much of the Aegean, the Adriatic, the Hebridean Shelf, the Western Black Sea, the Alboran. Europe, in this sense, has many lost coasts, all of which once held people, and almost all of which we have only just begun to map. Jeff Bailey and Nicholas Fleming had earlier, in 2008, published a foundational review in Quaternary Science Reviews, Archaeology of the Continental Shelf, that made the case for treating the world's continental shelves as a vast and largely untouched archive of submerged landscapes and underwater sites. That paper has now been cited several hundred times. It changed the framing of the whole subdiscipline. What all of this means, in cumulative effect, is that Doggerland is no longer a single anomalous story. It is the headline entry in a much larger emerging field, the archaeology of the world's drowned coasts. There are similar projects, in different stages of development, on the Mediterranean shelves of southern Europe, on the Sunderland shelf of Southeast Asia, on the Sahul shelf of Australia, on the Beringia of Alaska and Siberia. The Holocene transgression did not just affect the North Sea. It affected every continental shelf on Earth, And on every continental shelf on Earth, in different proportions and different stages, the late Pleistocene and early Holocene human story is partly underwater. Doggerland is the model case. Doggerland is the place where the methods are being most fully developed. What we have, after all of this, is a country that is, slowly and carefully, being read again. It is being read by trawler bycatch. It is being read by sediment cores. It is being read by sedimentary DNA. It is being read by 3D seismic. It is being read by the patient pacing of retired schoolteachers along Dutch beaches at low tide on quiet October mornings. Each of these is small. Together, they are restoring a missing country to the shared memory of Europe. It is unfinished work. It is going to be unfinished work for a long time. The country was very large, and the dirt is very deep, and the budgets are very small. But the work is happening. It is happening. The evidence accumulates. The country is no longer entirely silent. There is one more thing worth saying about all of this. The work has, by now, become a slow act of cultural restitution. It is not only science, it is also a long, quiet act of memory. The people of Doggerland left no written record. They left no monument. They left no flag. They have no descendants who carry their name.
But they did leave us. Actually, in the literal genetic sense, those of us with Western European ancestry have a small slice of their DNA somewhere in our cells. And in a sense, the slow work of mapping their drowned country is the closest thing we can offer them to a memorial. Not in stone, not in marble. In data, in sediment cores, in careful, patient seismic surveys. It is a strange kind of honor. The honor we pay to the dead by remembering at last where they lived. There are, around the rim of the southern North Sea, small museum displays now. The Harpoon from the Colinda is one of them. There are others. A glass case in Leiden with the Neanderthal skull fragment. A small panel in a coastal museum in Norfolk with a half-dozen worked flints from beneath the sea. A reconstruction of a Mesolithic camp in Bradford. None of them are large. None of them attract the visitor numbers of the great national collections in London or Paris or Amsterdam. But they are there, quiet, scholarly, patient. The slow inventory of a country that, until 30 years ago, did not even have a name in any language. This is, in the end, what archaeology is mostly for. Not to dig up the spectacular, not to find treasure, not to feed the news cycle, to restore the unreturning to memory, to keep the names when there are names, and to give names when there are no names, to the people who lived and worked and loved on the same earth as us, before the earth's slow seas closed over them. Somewhere, beneath your sleeping continent, a country still holds its breath.
What does it mean, then, that a country still holds its breath beneath your sleeping continent? It means, first, that the world is older than your map. The map you carry in your head, the coastlines, the borders, the shapes of countries, is a map of a particular moment, a particular sea level, a particular spread of forest, a particular distribution of climate. The world you live on is much older than the map you live with. The world has had other shapes. The world will, in some long future, have other shapes again. The map is a snapshot. The world is not. It means, second, that the line between human history and natural history is a soft one. We tend to imagine a clean separation. There is geology, which is slow and grand and non-human. There is history, which is fast and detailed and full of names. They occupy different shelves in the library. Doggerland refuses that separation. Its long drowning is simultaneously a piece of climate history, a piece of glacial geology, a piece of marine sedimentation, and a piece of the human story. It belongs to no one shelf. It belongs to all of them. It means, third, that under your continent, beneath your floors and your roads and your remembered childhoods, there are countries you have never been told about. Doggerland is one. There are others. Sunderland, beneath the modern South China Sea. Sahul, beneath the Arafura Sea. Beringia, beneath the Bering Strait. The Black Sea Shelf, beneath the modern Black Sea. The continental shelf of southern Africa, beneath the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. Each one of them was, at some point in the last 100,000 years, dry land. Each one of them was, at some point, walked on by people. Each one of them is now underwater. Together, they amount to a missing continent's worth of human prehistory. Doggerland is the closest of them to most of you. It is also the best mapped. It is the one that, in this slow night's work, we have come to know. Let us, before we let it slip back into the dark, hold its outline in mind one more time. A wide, low country between modern eastern Britain, northern France, Belgium, the Netherlands, northwestern Germany, and Jutland. A country of slow rivers, the Schotten among them, and wide marshes, of birch and oak and hazel and elm, of red deer and elk and aurochs and wild boar, of cranes and geese and bitterns at dawn. A country of small Mesolithic camps, of barbed antler harpoons, of dugout canoes, of the patient yearly rhythm of hunting and fowling and fishing. A country whose dominant northern culture was Maglemosian, and whose people were Western hunter-gatherers, and whose contemporaries on dry land included the man we know as Cheddar Man, and the makers of the antler frontlets at Star Car. A country of perhaps 100,000 square kilometres, at one time the most populated and most prosperous part of all northwest Europe, the heart of the Mesolithic, not the periphery. And then a country slowly drowned. Between 10,000 and 7,000 years before our present, by the rising waters of the Holocene transgression, disintegrated first into a series of low-lying islands, then, by around 6,500 BCE, separated from the British Peninsula entirely, the day Britain became an island. Then, by around 5000 BCE, even the high ground of the Dogger Bank surrendered to the sea. A country struck in its last centuries by the 8.2 kilo-year cooling, by the slow climate downturn, by the great wave of the Storegga slide somewhere around 6200 BCE that may have killed up to a quarter of Mesolithic Britain on the worst affected coasts, and may have only patchily affected others. The science is not yet settled. The science is still learning. The country is still being read. A country named, finally, in 1998, by an English archaeologist named Bryony Coles. A country mapped between 2003 and 2007 by Vincent Gaffney and Ken Thompson at Birmingham in 23,000 square kilometres of seismic detail. A country still being mapped today by the Europe's Lost Frontiers project at Bradford. A country whose secrets are now being read in the form of sedimentary DNA, oak and elm and hazel and lime present in its forests 16,000 years ago, earlier than in surrounding parts of Europe. A country whose drowned shell middens at Hjarnø and Tibrind and elsewhere give us a faint material window into how its peoples, or their close cousins, lived and ate and worked. A country, in short, that has gone from a small footnote to a real living place in the European archaeological imagination in the space of a single human lifetime. And at the centre of all of this, a single small thing. A barbed antler point, dropped onto a Dutch trawler deck on a cold morning in September of 1931. A piece of evidence too sharp to ignore. The first hard proof in the popular consciousness that the bottom of the southern North Sea was once the surface of a world. We have been with that world all night. Now, slowly, we will let it go. Close your eyes. The Harpoon is back in its drawer in a small museum where it has waited patiently for almost 100 years. The trawler Colinda is long gone, broken up, sold for scrap, replaced by other boats with other names. The fishermen who hauled the peat are long dead. They did not know on that cold morning that they were participants in a moment that would change how a continent thought about itself. They thought they were fishing. The rivers and the marshes of Doggerland have by now 8,000 years of marine sediment piled over them. The sediment is laid down year by year in a slow, continuous rain of silt and shell and dead diatom. It is, mostly, very quiet down there. Bottom trawl currents stir the top centimetre. Below the top centimetre, the country sleeps. The red deer of the Shotten River are bone now. The aurochs are bone. The wild boar are bone. The harpoons are bone. The houses are wood fragment and post hole. The fires are charcoal in a layer of peat. The people themselves, the Maglemosian foragers, the western hunter-gatherers, the bird watchers and the eel trappers and the bittern listeners, are mostly dust. A small fragment of them survives, faintly, in the genome of every modern Northwest European. A dim, small shadow in your own cells, perhaps. A whisper of pigmentation, of a metabolic preference, of an immune system variant. A piece of someone you will never know who lived on a country you will never see. But as you drift towards sleep, maybe you can imagine it. A wide, low marsh in summer at the height of an early Atlantic phase year. The reeds quiet in the evening, the slow river smelling of wet earth, the small camp on the gravel terrace, 4 or 5 low hide and pole shelters, the small fires banked for the night, a dog asleep near the warm coals. A child, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, half asleep against the warm flank of an older sister inside one of the shelters. Smoke rising up to the dark roof beam. Outside somewhere, an owl. Somewhere further, the long, deep boom of a bittern in the marsh. Geese passing overhead in the dark,
on their way to the next stopover. The child does not know that her grandchildren will move slightly inland. The child does not know that her great-great-great-grandchildren will see the lagoon turn salty. The child does not know that 10 generations down the line, a wave will come from the north. The child knows only the sound of the older sister's breath, the smell of the dog's fur, the warmth of the dying coals, the slow boom of the bittern in the marsh. This was a real night. Many millions of nights just like it were real on this country. We have lost the names. We have lost the songs. We have not quite lost the shape of those nights. Now, picture gently your own night. You are perhaps in a bed, perhaps in a quiet room, perhaps on a sofa in a slightly less quiet room. Outside your window, somewhere in northwest Europe or beyond, the world is dark. If you are at this moment anywhere on the rim of the modern North Sea, in eastern Britain, in northern France, in the Low Countries, in northern Germany, in Denmark, you are sleeping above what was once a country. The seabed is below you. The sediment is below the seabed. The country, in some unbroken material way, is below the sediment. 2 nights, separated by 8,000 years. The Mesolithic child in her hide shelter on the gravel terrace with the bittern booming in the marsh. You in your bed with the small electric hum of a city far away. The same continent, the same dark, the same quiet, ongoing world. The same slow tide that is, even now, in the small geological way, still rising over both of you. It is all right. The country is at rest. The wave came and went, and the centuries closed over it. Britain became an island. The sea took the heart. And then, 8,000 years later, in the patient, slow work of a small number of researchers in offices in Birmingham and Bradford and Leiden and Aarhus, the country began to be remembered again. It is being remembered now, by you, as you slip towards sleep, as your own night moves slowly like the slow water over the dark surface of the southern North Sea. Whatever country you live in, whatever beach is closest to you tonight, whatever river's mouth you grew up beside, there is, almost certainly, somewhere not far from you, a coastline that is older than the one on the map. A submerged country, a half-buried place, the rim of some forgotten Mesolithic of your own. You are sleeping, in the simplest way of saying it, on a planet whose floors are not all dry. Most of the time, you do not need to think about it. Most of the time, you should not. Most of the time, the quiet, small pleasures of a warm bed and a quiet evening, and the small rituals of going to sleep, are exactly what your body needs and exactly what the night is for. But tonight, just tonight, as you drift, hold one image: the slow gray water of the southern North Sea, somewhere over the place where the Jutland River used to run. No boats, no lights, only the calm, dark water, 8,000 years of patient sediment, and beneath it, a country sleeping. It is all right.
It has been all right for a very long time. The country is not lost. The country is held. The country is being read again. And you, tonight, are part of how it is held. This is the strange, small honor the drowned country offers us. The Mesolithic foragers of Doggerland did not, of course, ever imagine us. They had no idea that 8,000 years downstream from their bittern loud evenings, there would be people listening to a long narration in a language they had never heard, on devices they could never have understood, lying in beds they could never have built, on a continent whose shape they would not have recognized. They could not imagine us. We can, just barely, imagine them. That asymmetry is, in one small sense, what memory is. The dead cannot reach forward. The living can reach back. Every patient piece of work, every seismic slice, every sediment core, every bone catalogued in a quiet museum drawer in Leiden or Norwich, is a hand reaching backward, gently, into the dark. Tonight, your hand is one of them. You will not remember most of what was said in this long, quiet hour. That is fine. You are not meant to. The point of a sleep narration is not retention. The point is companionship in the slow turn from waking into rest. The names will fade. The dates will fade. The Storegga and the Schotten and the Maglemosian and the Western hunter-gatherers will all blur slowly into the slow gray color of the water above the seabed. What will perhaps remain is something more vague and more useful. A faint sense in the back of the mind that the world is older than the map, that the sea floor is, in places, the surface of someone else's home, that under your continent there is, tonight, a country, and it is at rest, and it is being remembered, and it is all right. Let that be the small thing you carry into sleep, the slow gray water, the patient sediment, the drowned heart. The bittern at evening on a marsh whose name we will never know 8,000 years ago. And above all of it now, you, quiet, warm, held. Sleep well, child of the drowned coast. Good night.